In The Return of the King, there is a character that appears in the story for a total of just 4 pages, but despite having such a minor appearance, this character has become popular, earning themselves interesting depictions in films, video games, and fan fiction. So in this episode of Middle-earth Mysteries, we look at the man only known as the Mouth of Sauron. Who was he? Where did he come from? How old was he? What happened to him? As always, it's easy to start with what we do know about the Mouth of Sauron. His physical description isn't really described. He's tall, dressed all in black, and is wearing a lofty helm, but it's clear that he's a living man and not a ringwraith. It's then told that he was a renegade, a member of the race of Black Númenóreans, and that he entered the service of Sauron when Barad-dur first arose again. Thanks to his cunning and talent, he rose to become one of Sauron's most favoured servants, and when he appears before the Black Gate, he's said to be the Lieutenant of Barad-dur, a powerful sorcerer, close to Sauron's councils and crueler than any orc. And that's about it. We don't actually know his name, we don't know where exactly he came from, we don't know his age, we don't know what happened to him, but as with much of Tolkien's writings, there's enough hints lying around that paints us a somewhat more complete picture of the Mouth of Sauron. And although he's realistically a minor character, Tolkien had plenty of ideas about the character in his drafts. Okay, so we know the Mouth of Sauron was a Black Númenórean. What we know about the Black Númenóreans is that their fortunes quickly faded throughout the Third Age. As described by Faramir, they fought amongst themselves, dwindled, and were then mostly overthrown by the lesser men whom they had subjugated. In the case of the Black Númenóreans of Umbar, they were decisively defeated by Gondor around 1050 of the Third Age. But the existence of the Mouth of Sauron proves that the Black Númenóreans still existed in some form by the end of the Third Age, possibly like the Dunedain of Gondor, still in power somewhere but dwindling and ruling over an increasingly large population of middlemen. Alternatively, they could be like the Dunedain of the North, existing in small, isolated communities trying to preserve what was left of their heritage. So the Mouth of Sauron could have been from somewhere south of Umbar, somewhere that Gondor never conquered, somewhere that still has a lot more Black Númenórean influence. Alternatively, he could have also come from Umbar, a descendant of those Black Númenórean lords who had once ruled the city. Remember, Umbar has been in the hands of the Haradrim since around 1850, so it's possible that Black Númenóreans returned soon afterwards, possibly mixing with the Corsairs. The fact that the Mouth of Sauron is a Black Númenórean also gives us a hint about his age. Now, we're told that he entered the service of Sauron when the Dark Tower arose again. This has led some people to believe that it means he first entered Sauron's service in the Second Age, but there's no evidence that Sauron could artificially extend the lifespan of the Mouth of Sauron without him turning into a wraith, much like what had happened to the Nazgul. I know some people say that the fact that the Mouth of Sauron has forgotten his own name implies that he must be extremely old, but keep in mind, King Thrain II had forgotten his own name after just a few years of torment in Dol Guldur. It's possible that the Mouth of Sauron messing with dark sorcery has messed up his own memory. The far more likely explanation is that the Mouth of Sauron entered the service of Sauron in or around 2953, when Barad-dur arose again. This would imply that he's been in the service of Sauron for somewhere between 60 to 70 years, and if we say that he entered Sauron's service around the age of 20, that would make him 80 to 90 years old by the time of his appearance. Interestingly, he was probably around the same age as Aragorn, a dark mirror if you will. You might think this makes him too old, but it's worth noting that if the Mouth of Sauron is a true Black Númenórean, his lifespan would still be longer than a normal man's. He might have as many as 20 to 30 years left in him. Okay, so we know where he might have come from and what his approximate age might have been, but what about his name? Well, leaving aside an individual name for the moment, even the Mouth of Sauron as a name itself is a little interesting, considering Sauron hated the name Sauron and forbid its use, given that it means abhorred in Quenya. It might be that the Mouth of Sauron's actual name was translated to that when the Lord of the Rings was being written by Frodo, and in that moment, at the Black Gate, the Mouth of Sauron actually called himself something else and referred to Sauron differently. Alternatively, as an emissary, it might be that the Mouth of Sauron had permission or felt it was necessary to refer to Sauron as, well, Sauron. But from some draft writings that appear in the War of the Ring, Book 8 of the History of Middle-earth, the Mouth of Sauron is referred to as Mordu. Paul Strack, a Tolkien linguist, suggests that this name is Noldoran and that it means Black Knight. But realistically, it makes little sense for the Mouth of Sauron to have a Noldoran name, given that there's a very high chance that he wouldn't have even known the language. This was probably just a relic of Tolkien's earlier writings. In all likelihood, the Mouth of Sauron would have had an Adunaic name. For example, the name that Lord of the Rings Online gives him is Dulgabeth, which translates to Black Word. If we're translating Black Knight, then the Mouth's name might have been something like Dulganulu or Dolgalomi. To be honest, neither of those are very good names. And finally, what happened to the Mouth of Sauron? Unfortunately, your guess is as good as mine. Unlike in the films, he is not murdered by Aragorn in the books. That's a war crime. No, there's no Geneva Convention in Middle-earth, but Gandalf even states that no harm will come to him while he's negotiating. But when the Mouth of Sauron rides off, we never see him again. It's possible that he dies during the Battle of the Morannon, either slain in battle or perhaps even killing himself like some of Sauron's forces did after Sauron was destroyed. Alternatively, he could have survived the battle. We know that some of the Host of the West entered Mordor after the battle to mop up some of Sauron's remaining forces and fortresses in the region of Udun. It's possible that the Mouth of Sauron, as the Lieutenant of Barad-dur, was one of the highest ranked survivors and was trying to offer some resistance. An interesting scenario appears in the Lord of the Rings Online, where the Mouth of Sauron becomes engaged in a power struggle with some of the other powerful remaining figures in Mordor. Spoiler alert, the Mouth of Sauron is in over his head, and it does not go well for him. Realistically, I think there's a very good chance that the Mouth of Sauron was either killed in the battle or died in the aftermath. He was highly ranked in Sauron's hierarchy, and hadn't exactly done himself any favours when he was negotiating with his enemies. Given his status, unless he immediately fled Mordor, he probably wasn't left alone to do whatever he wanted, and was either a target in the battle or in the immediate days afterwards. Or maybe he lived happily ever after, who knows. So to summarise, what can we say about the Mouth of Sauron? Remember, most of what I've said in the video isn't strictly canon, and I'm just making educated guesses, using literally all the information that we have about him at our disposal. In my opinion, he was likely from Umbar or a city further to the south. He was probably born in the late 2920s or early 2930s, making him between the ages of 80 and 90 when he appears at the Black Gate, around the same age as Aragorn. His name might have been Mordu, or an Adunaic translation of Mordu, or something similar. And he probably died in the Battle of the Morannon, or in the aftermath of it. I mentioned at the very start of the video that Tolkien kind of spent a little bit of time on this character despite how briefly he appears, so I want to mention some of the other origins that he played around with for the Mouth of Sauron. Although he was decided to be a Black Númenórean who willingly entered Sauron's service, Tolkien had two other origins for him. The first origin says that he was a man who was captured as a youth, brought up in the Dark Tower, and corrupted until he became one of Sauron's most powerful servants. The second origin has him as a Gondorian renegade, the son of a noble house who willingly joined Sauron because he became enamored with dark knowledge. But finally, for whatever reason, Tolkien settled on the idea of making him a Black Númenórean. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. If you want to see more of the Mouth of Sauron, he's one of the primary villains in the Lord of the Rings Online Mordor expansion. While I don't agree with some of the ideas about the character, I think his design is really cool, and I like how he calls himself Sauron's heir, even though that's very much an exaggeration. Cheers, farewell, and remember, the Mouth of Sauron might not be the nicest name, but there's also far worse names he could have had.